Hello, my name is Gunilla. I'm a Swedish journalist and I'm also going to be moderating a debate discussion we're going to have now with our panelists. I hope you liked the film. I thought myself it was a very strong film. Interesting, fascinating and strong. And now we're going to talk about the situation for human rights defenders. As we heard before, more than 300 human rights defenders were killed last year. That is a lot. Only in 12% of the cases someone gets arrested. So the impunity is massive. Still, the world has maybe more human rights defenders than ever. So the conviction is there. The movement is global, which is good, but the impunity is too high. I'd like to introduce to you our panelists. Welcome up, please. And we will start our discussion. Let me introduce them to you. Welcome. Welcome. So we will have a discussion here now in English, in French, and then we will also open to all of you. You can ask your questions in English, French, as you like. First, I welcome Maryam Al-Khawaja, who is a human rights defender from Bahrain, consultant for numerous NGOs, and also comes from a family of defenders. Michel Forst, welcome. You're the UN Special Rapporteur on situation of human rights defenders. You've also been instrumental in the creation of the Declaration for Human Rights. This is 20 years ago now. This is what we're celebrating this year. Gerald, Staberock, welcome very much. You're the Secretary General of the World Organization Against Torture, OMCT. You also run one of the world's biggest human rights defenders protection programs, which you also heard about before, and you will tell us more about, because this is something for the future that is hopeful to make the situation better. And Ana Maria Rodriguez Valencia, welcome. You are coordinating international advocacy at the Colombian Commission of Jurists, Colombian lawyer. Welcome, all of you. Let me start by asking you what you think about the film. Your thoughts, your feelings. Would you like to start, Gerald?
Okay. Does this work? Yes. I think an impressive film, an impressive personality. But when I think about what does the film tell me about human rights defenders, our topic today, there are maybe 3 or 4 topoi that come to my heart or to my mind. The first one is belief. I always find it fascinating. You meet people from very difficult countries, and they have a very strong belief that they can change at the same time. From outside, you might think it's hopeless, but it's not. And they struggle, and they use all the tools they have to make a difference, but they have this fundamental belief that their state could be better. And I think that's something we see in human rights defenders very often. The second point is actors for change. We sometimes have this impression human rights defenders are a little bit the nerd, the nuisance, because they're against things. And I think if you see that film, you have somebody who has a vision, who wants to change the country, who wants to move it in a different direction. And we often in this land rights context have the impression somebody opposes development. I think this person here and what this organization does is much more about development, sustainable development, a better future, a better rule of law, a less corrupted world. And very much I think we should see human rights defenders as actors for change. The third quick point I put was in the very end it says, somebody said, thanks to you, we know our rights. And I think this is very much about what human rights defenders are about. And maybe the fourth point is simply, You've seen a very difficult context with land rights offenders that we see in many other places. What you maybe haven't seen in the film is the level of threat that many of these people face. You had a little bit about the NGO, the defamation, etc. But I think that those are the 4 topoi for me that come to my mind when I see the film.
Interesting. You're quite right about the point of, now we have people didn't know about their rights. The thing we didn't see that much true is the threat and the fear. We saw the intimidation, human rights defenders, but we didn't see the threats and the fears. What do you think, Maryam? What were your reactions and thoughts?
So definitely reiterating, what my colleague was saying about one of the most basic things that you need as a human rights defender is believing that you can actually create change. Because if you don't believe that you can create change and you don't have the hope that things will change, then it's very difficult to continue working as a human rights defender. But I think what really struck me is how, doing outreach and being a part of communities is also a way to change. And I think that that's a very important discussion that needs to be ongoing all the time within the human rights community, that we shouldn't view, the work of human rights and defending human rights as a top-bottom approach, where we think we're coming in as human rights defenders and telling people how they should be doing things, but rather working within the community, with the community, to build a better country, for sure.
Michel, les questions, vous préférez parler en français peut-être, votre réflexion après avoir vu les films.
D'abord, je crois qu'il faut pas.
So, you can't deny the cinematographic qualities of the film. So, I'm not a member of the jury, but if I were a member of the jury, I would tend to say this is a good film that deserves to be in competition with others. But, on the more serious side, what struck me in the film is, the reflection of a reality that I meet every day when I travel the different countries and I meet with defenders in many, many cases. One doesn't decide or one chooses to become a human rights defender. That's the case of this silence. It's very often because oneself feels threatened in one's own family life or also in the everyday work one does. And, one becomes a defender because one tries to defend one's land or what is, at the very heart of one's life. And, in South America and in Kashmir, and people have become defenders for simply the reason that they strive to find those that had disappeared and who had actually been kidnapped and tortured by the authorities. And as we can see in the film, and as Gerald reminded us, those who are the most threatened are those who defenders of environmental law. You reminded us of the number of defenders who were assassinated in the last few years. And it's true that those who are the most threatened and the largest numbers of those who are assassinated are those who defend the environment. And the second thing I'd like to also say, and that might actually give us food for thought or debate, and this is a film that actually shows us a real portrait of a defender without hiding, the failings and the limits of the character. And this is extremely important for me, for all of us, because, we are, leading a campaign for the 20th anniversary of the Human Rights Declaration to change the image of defenders, to show them, in a positive image, and to show that they are not enemies of the state, they are not enemies of the environment, and they're not enemies of progress or development. They are men and women who are doing the best to, make, reality of those rights that we proclaimed 70 years ago. And I think embassies will do their best to show portraits of defenders, and not those who are the best known, but these men and women who day in, day out, sometimes under difficult situations, are defenders, and they actually need to be protected. So we need to show them in the histories.
After, but first I want to ask you also what your thoughts were and impressions from the film.
Well, I would highlight 2 points also. The first one is that I was thinking at some moment during the film that the scenes we were seeing with what was happening to communities, the approach of companies could be happening not only in Liberia, but anywhere in Colombia, in Guatemala, in Honduras, in Peru, or almost anywhere. And the situation that communities face and what defenders do there is very similar, although they are indigenous leaders, peasant leaders, Afro-descendants, anywhere. So although particular countries have particular conditions, the problems are very similar, and the work that we have to do as defenders is similar. And on the other hand, it was very nice to see the everyday life of a defender, what their families have to go through, what their friends think of you all the time. You usually tend to think as a defender on you and your job and your commitment, and many times you forget the people that surround you. And I like very much from the movie that you can see what the family has to deal when you are a defender.
Yeah, I thought that was also a very smart thing to do. You really saw from the eyes of another person, not only the defender himself. 20 years of the Human Rights Declaration. I want to ask you about this. It, of course, was very important. It was created. 20 years has passed. What has really been accomplished? What has changed? Has the situation become better for human rights in the world? Really?
That's the easy question.
Who wants to start?
Voilà, je ne vais pas répondre forcément directement.
Okay, I might not give you a direct answer to the question. This is what I try to do when, I'm embarrassed by the questions I'm being asked. But let me tell you that, if I, think 30 years back when I was a director of Amnesty in France, and with the other members of Amnesty, we used to receive so many requests on the part of defenders. We didn't used to call them defenders at the time, but, we would call them more individuals or NGO activists fighting for their rights. And we come to realize, 20 years later, a lot has been done, and we've made a lot of progress just in the field of protection. I hope we'll have time to speak further of the progress that's been made, and also the failings and what remains to be done. But I think one of the major victory is the declaration that gives us a reason for hope, and that gives us a very wide definition of who the defenders are. They're not just activists of different NGOs, not people who are members of a group, but I think any individual, a man, a woman, a child who tries to promote rights and freedom is a defender, even if that person is also a politician or an activist. The second thing I want to say and tell you is the success of these thousands, millions of groups, organizations, men and women who are defenders, these regional networks that are becoming more stronger and stronger, and that work day in, day out, and they risk their lives to make rights and freedom reality, and that the stronger the networks, the stronger the defenders, the better organized they are, the more ferocious is repression. And repression today is ferocious on the part of states. This is not a blind violence; it's a highly targeted violence that targets those who are responsible. And the person who received the Goldman Prize, Bertin Caceres, and I'm afraid for Silas's life, and all these people who are awarded prizes, and the states are becoming more and more ferocious and violent, and so we have to now, continue, finding mechanisms that will make it possible to actually fight these new threats that are upon the defenders. And there are mechanisms that have been created. We're not going to talk about them now, perhaps at a later stage, but these mechanisms are effective in protecting defenders.
Would you like to say something, Gerald?
Maybe just in the same line. We celebrate 70 years of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, and only 20 years of the Human Rights Defenders Declaration. You would think that the two are connected, that if you set out the rights, the most fundamental one is that people in peace and security can work on the realization of those rights. And apparently it took 50 years to recognize this. And I think this is the significance that happened 20 years ago. And I think that's very fundamental. And I agree with Michel Forst that we've never been as global as a human rights movement. I mean, maybe on a more personal note, when I was a student and then an intern here in Geneva at some point, and you went to some UN meeting, you had only Western organizations being there. If you go there today, people are from everywhere. My own organization, the World Organization Against Torture, is a network. We started with 30 organizations or something in 30 years ago. Now it's 290. It's everywhere. And I think that's very important because we sometimes forget the achievements that we've done. We speak about human rights defenders protection, and we're always on the protection side, so we deal with the threats, but we shouldn't forget those achievements. And we shouldn't also forget that maybe 20 years ago, the fight for LGBT rights, the fight for disability rights, was at a very different state where it is today. But as Michel said, and I think that's worth the discussion, is as we become more global, as we are more a real movement, we face a new wind that comes our way, and more threats, and more laws, and more killings, and more impunity.
If I may add. I mean, I definitely agree with what has been said, but I think that from, I've been working as a human rights defender for 9 years now, officially. And I've seen, I think that I might be a little more pessimistic. Given how, if we look at the situation in the world today, and the political climate in the world today, I would say that we are regressing when it comes to human rights, unfortunately. Even the countries who generally were seen as being on the forefront of protecting and defending human rights and human rights defenders. Countries like Scandinavia, for example. I'm a Danish citizen, and I know that Denmark and some other countries in Scandinavia have now cut down funding in some of the countries by 40% for protection of human rights defenders. And so we're seeing the situation, unfortunately, get worse when you're looking at how the elections are going in places like Poland and Hungary and Italy, and now we already had in the United States. I think generally we're looking at a situation where if we don't understand the importance of intersectionality when it comes to human rights, and as was mentioned, how our struggles as human rights defenders, but also as populations, are actually very much connected and attached to each other, we are going to get into a situation that is much worse. And I think that the best evidence of this is that, after Rwanda, after World War II, after all of that, and a lot of these institutions are the product of those events, we said never again. We said this will happen, never again. And yet it's happening over and over again. It's happening in Syria, it's happening in Yemen, it's happening in Myanmar, it's happening in Iraq, and it's a continuation. And unfortunately, despite these institutions, despite some of the progress that we have made, for example, now, for the first time, we have, special mechanisms on reprisals, how to deal with cases of human rights defenders who interact with the UN and who are then targeted specifically for interacting with the UN. But the United Nations as an institution is so politicized that there are people, for example, in Bahrain who have spent the last 7 years in prison, like my father, and who wasn't someone who is a case of reprisal, and yet he's still in prison. And the number of people who are actually being subjected to reprisals has increased, not decreased. And so I think that generally it's easy to talk about, how great human rights defenders are and how we wish we could support them, and, how we love Gandhi and Martin Luther King, and if we were there those days, we would have marched with them down the streets. But there are thousands of Gandhis and Martin Luther Kings today sitting in prison cells. We can march with them, and we can stand with them.
On a more personal note there, what made, especially the two of you, you're really human rights defenders in the field, so to speak, what made you become human rights defender? Do you want to start?
Yes.
Your own personal story.
I guess my story is not as interesting as yours. No, I just went to college, went to law school, was not feeling very comfortable into other fields of law, and started wondering what's actually happening in my country. Many decades of unarmed conflict in Colombia, lots of different types of violence. I wanted to learn more, and I started to approach a little bit to some of those issues, and I started to feel like I also wanted to help in a way, to make a contribution from what I could do at that point, and so it started 20 years ago.
Yeah, 20 years ago. And Maryam, is it your father that plays a big role, or?
Well, I would say definitely my father for sure, but I think my mother mostly as well. My mother is the strongest woman that I've ever met. We grew up in a house where we were taught about human rights, and we were taught about how important it is to stand up and fight for justice. And so one of the things that we were taught, every night before we slept, we had to ask, what did I do today to make something better for someone other than myself? And if the answer was nothing, then that was a day wasted. And so that's the kind of lesson that we grew up learning. But I think what really pushed me to be in the role that I'm in today is the revolution in Bahrain, the uprising. Having been there on the ground, watching people around me get killed, get tortured, get imprisoned. And that's why for me, while I might talk about my father's case because I know him personally, obviously, his family and so on, but my father's not the exception, he's the rule. We have thousands of people who are in prison, thousands of people who are paying such a high price for simply demanding things like basic human rights and democracy and elections. And so for me, just watching how thousands of people came to the streets and demanded democracy, demanded human rights, the best way to describe it is kind of like if you've been living underwater most of your life and then you come out above water and you breathe for the first time. That's what it felt like in 2011. It was as if for the first time we knew what oxygen felt like. And you can't take that away from someone. You can't pull someone back underwater after they've tried having oxygen and tell them you're going to live underwater again. And that's why the protests continue till today.
How is it being a woman and human rights defenders? Is it tougher? Do you have more threats, more intimidation, a more difficult time to work? I'd like to hear from both of you, and also from you being, the rapporteur. What would you say?
Well, I would say we face the usual attacks and the usual aggressions, the threats of killings, disappearances. I mean, like the regular attacks that a defender suffers. But I think we also suffer two types of additional aggressions. One has to do with our role as women, in many cases as mothers or members of a family. So we have seen many cases in Colombia of sexual aggressions against defenders, or not necessarily against the defender, but the persons around her. Their relatives, their daughters, the women that work with them are the targets of the attacks, or threats against their children, or harassment to the children around the school, things like that. And on the other side, there's the challenges that are more internal, so to say it, that have to do with the usual practices, labor practices being a woman. So you have to face salary issues, you have to face, relations with your bosses, you have to face not being listened at some point, even if you're saying the same thing as your neighbor, but he's a man, he's listened to, you're not. So are not particular challenges for women human rights defenders, but it's harder if you're trying to raise your voice or share a message with a lot of people and you are not listened to because you're a woman.
Interesting. Maryam, do you find that too?
Yes, definitely. I think, so most of my work right now, because I'm sentenced to 1 year in Bahrain and I'm wanted there, so I can't go back. So most of my time I spend it outside of the Middle East, mostly in Europe and the United States. And I think it's 2 degrees. One is being a woman and the other is being a woman of color. Because being a woman of color also has its impacts, and you're even less so listened to, and you're, again and again told how articulate you are, and you're asked why your English is so good, and things like that. And so I've definitely had a lot of experience with that, so definitely agree with everything that was said. The only other thing that I would mention is discourse. I think what's extremely problematic is discourse, because when we talk about the role of women, we always talk about it as if it was something that wasn't very natural, that came as an addition. And so we talk about how women joined the revolution. We talk about how the women human rights defenders joined the human rights community, as if it's not something that came naturally and was organic. But if you look at history, and yes, it's his story, and we need more of her story because that's usually not documented as well. But for example, just to take Bahrain as an example, where we've had one of the oldest civil rights movements in the region since the 1920s, with uprisings almost every 10 years. Women have always been at the forefront of that. Women have always led. Women have always, been subjected to the same violations and crimes by the government because they were at the forefront. And so I think one of the things that we also need to do, even us women ourselves, we need to change our discourse. And we need to change the way we talk about these things and make sure that when we talk about it, we're using the correct form and the correct terminology.
Michel, do you see that women are more under threat, have a more challenging time being a woman human rights defenders?
Définitivement, ouais. Quand j'ai commencé avec ce...
Yes, absolutely. When I started in 2014, when I received the mandate, I met with a representative of the World Coalition of Women Defenders. This is what they told us, that if I should try and meet women on their own to ask the men to leave the room, and you'll see what happens, and you'll see. And that's exactly what I do, and I continue proceeding that way. And every time, I make an official visit to a given country, and or if I'm invited by a university or by academia, I always make sure to organize a meeting with female defenders. And every time I hear the same story, which was said here, and the fact, and again, you already are threatened as a defender, but if you're on top of that, you're a woman, you're going to be threatened. The sexual nature, family members being threatened. Many women tell us that because, in many cases they are, in charge of their parents and grandparents. These close family members are under threat, and many of those women tell me how difficult it is when you are really under serious threat, death threat, to have to leave the place when you're being an activist. For a man, it's easy, and if he's under threat, there are techniques that you can actually exfiltrate him to a foreign country. But for women, it's much more difficult because they don't want to leave their families behind, they don't want to leave their children, and there are no real solutions to actually protect these women with their children. I mean, there are some initiatives around the world that are seeing the day. And the second thing is what our witness of today is the behavior in the non-governmental organizations. And this is very striking and quite surprising and mind-boggling to hear this. That women say that they're given roles such as minor defend of minor rights, right to health and civil rights defense is actually given to men. And I wanted to organize specific consultations for the female defenders around the world. And I remember once, when we wrote a letter, we asked a women defender to participate in a meeting we were organizing in Europe, and we received a letter saying, we have a consultant, it's the director of the organization who will come. I said, no, I want this woman to come. And the answer I get, well, there will be no participation of our organization. I mean, this may seem a caricature, but I think it's very telling of what it is, we come up against, as regards the work of women within their own organizations.
I was remembering, listening to Michel, of a history we had a couple of months ago. Some of my colleagues were taking part of a discussion with the National Protection Unit in Colombia, who's in charge of offering protection measures for defenders at risk. And this was a really weird discussion because it was a woman human rights defender that has to leave her town. And the discussion was because she was asking for the inclusion in her protection measures of the guarantee of school for her kids. And she wanted a scheme of vaccination for her kids, and she was asking for some type of medicines. I don't remember right now, and it was a huge discussion because the members of the protection unit did not understand why school or medicines or these type of things were part of protection measures. For them, it was a matter of a car, of a house, of a vest, of a cell phone, but not schooling. Why school? Why things for kids? And she was saying, I cannot live alone. I need to bring my family with me, but I cannot take my kids out of school if I cannot guarantee that they are going to school somewhere else. So it was a huge discussion. It was really, really difficult to come to an agreement because it was really difficult for them to understand what it was about.
Gerald, I wanted to ask you, you said that now it's become human rights defenders, it's a global movement. It is now everywhere and it's growing and it's coming really from inside countries. But at the same time, do we also see that the risks are really becoming bigger? I mean, I'm thinking both physical risks and legal risks.
I would say so. I think human rights defenders' work is not in isolation of the human rights situation in countries generally and the global context of human rights. And obviously, we think we face a climate change on human rights and maybe even more. You have more and more countries that question the validity of human rights. You have discourses on national security, ISIS and others. You have migration discourses that are real game changer in how you see human rights. And then the threats to human rights defenders are sort of a consequences that comes after this. We have enormous physical threats, and there I think you have some regions or countries where the threat is physical in particular. You have Latin America with democracies who have the highest murder rates of human rights offenders. You have other countries where it's more legal measures. Think about Russia, where you have a plethora of laws that try to suffocate the human rights movement. And especially what we've seen over the last couple of years is the emergence of all these laws. You have one law after the other that makes it very difficult for organizations to function, to receive foreign funding, etc., whatever it is. But it is a concerted effort to suffocate the movement. And it targets in particular the global connection. In the old days, it was probably a protection if you were associated as a local organization with an international network. Now it can be a factor of risk if you're a human rights offender in Egypt today. If you receive funding from abroad as part of development aid, which is quite normal, this can be the reason to go against you. If you report to the United Nations, this can be a reason that you're targeted. So I think states see the impact that human rights work has, and they try to prevent it. And we see this all over the place. So I think, and there I agree with you, while we should celebrate what we have achieved in 20 years, while the movement is stronger, while we have won certain battles, there's clearly now a climate change. And I think this is also where Europe becomes important. I've been to Brussels a couple of weeks ago for a parliamentary hearing. The discourse you hear about NGO transparency and lacking accountability is mind-boggling to me. I mean, you've seen in this film a very corrupted government accusing the NGO community basically of being unaccountable, non-transparent. Yeah. The more corrupted, the more we hear this from governments. And I think that there is a suffocation that we see targeting the human rights movement as such.
All right, but then, well, you have the Human Rights Declaration for Human Rights Defenders, 20 years. It's a global movement. You're also saying that there are more threats and intimidations and legal obstacles. But can we see, and we have situations today like Egypt, Syria, Yemen, Bahrain, Myanmar, but is it getting better in any of these countries where human rights defenders are really active? Can we see, because you're giving me the picture that it's really getting worse. We have 20 years, it's become a global movement, but it's more difficult to be a human rights defender. Isn't it the opposite in any place?
I think to some extent, when you're effective and you hurt powerful interests, you have the counter-reaction. And you will always have in the world some countries where you have progress. Maybe in Tunisia, being a human rights offender, despite all difficulties today, is better than it was under Ben Ali. So there's no one solution for everything. And obviously the countries you have mentioned are countries that are gross human rights violations and deteriorating situations. But what I find striking is that you also have countries you don't talk about. India, a democracy, proud democracy, rule of law. One organization after the other is losing the right to receive foreign funding. We have a member organization that has been the permit cancelled to receive foreign funding. Why? Because they worked with you in Special Rapporteur on Human Rights Offenders. And nobody speaks about these countries. So the instinct is to say we speak about Yemen, we speak about Syria, we speak about Myanmar. But when it comes to human rights offenders, you could name so many of these other countries where you see really backlash is coming.
What? Yes, go ahead first.
If I can just add very quickly, I mean, I remember seeing this graffiti in Beirut that really stuck out to me, which says, it's very dangerous to be right when the government is wrong. And I think that that explains it really well. But I think one of the reasons why, even though we are making progress in regards to resolutions and declarations and to some extent also international law of protection for human rights, I think the main problem is that we have institutions that have been set up for protection of human rights that don't have the ability of accountability because of the way they're set up. And so if the United Nations, for example, because the Security Council has veto power, that's why Syria is still in the situation it's in, right?
Right.
And it's the same thing with many other countries. And so the problem is with accountability. If there's a reason for the government not to do what they're doing, it's because they're worried about being punished. If they know they're not going to be punished, if they know that there is, a culture of impunity, then they have no incentive to stop the violations.
Two questions there. One, how would you define a human rights defender? What is a human rights defender? How do you become a human rights defender?
You know, we are lucky enough to have a definition which has been set up and accepted by consensus by all the states 20 years ago. This is the definition which is in the United Nations declarations on the human rights defenders. And by chance, we are lucky enough to see that there is it is a good definition. You don't have to be registered. You don't have to be full-time defender. You don't have to be volunteer. It's just that you have to act to promote the rights, and you become a defender. You can be many things at the same time, like in Bahrain or in Tunisia under Ben Ali. You can be a political activist, and at the same time being a political activist, fighting for freedom and for free and democratic election, for freedom of association, for freedom of demonstration, for freedom of tweeting. You are being attacked by all these forms mentioned by Gerald. Though you have to keep this declaration because it's a warrant for the future. All the states we have been talking about are more and more ferocious against this definition. They are very sophisticated in their attacks. They make it underhand, but they also do it in the UN, within the UN systems. Certain states like Russia, who is the leader of them, they refuse to use this word of defender of human rights, saying that this word has no legal definition and is not registered. And by fighting this fight, their idea is to recognize as defender only the people recognized by the state. And so the state will be by himself decide who is a defender and who is not, and leaving all the defenders who will be registered in this organization without protection.
Yes, I would say that the biggest, or one of the biggest achievements after 20 years of having the declaration is precisely that you can now find people that recognizes themselves as defenders, people that 20 years or 10 years ago wouldn't have to. Now you find indigenous leaders, you find peasants in faraway regions, you find sexual workers, you find many different people that now recognize themselves as defenders, believe they have the right to defend what they are defending, and are empowered to go and ask from their authorities and from the state that the rights are respected. And I think that although we face new challenges and every time we find a new way to defend a right, the perpetrators find another one to violate them, that's an achievement, and that's a step forward. We are growing up as I don't know if a community, but as a group of people that believe that rights have to be defended, and I would say that's the biggest achievement in these 20 years.
Maybe just in the same token, when I grew up, I thought about human rights offenders like the Sakharovs of this world. In my generation, maybe this was. But it was always the sort of political dissident or human rights activist. and what we see now is anybody in land rights issues, etc. So the notion of who is a human rights defender and our consciousness of that, I think, has changed a lot. But I also wanted to get back to what Michel said about the recognized organizations. A very concrete, practical example. If I want to visit in my organization Egypt today, I'm told I can meet NGOs if they are registered. But basically, no organization that works on torture, provide victim support to torture victims, will be recognized. But basically, you can come and talk, but to nobody.
I just want to get back to what you were talking about too, Marianne, on impunity. I mean, as we said before, 12% of the people are being, in 12% of the cases, people are being arrested for killing human rights defenders. How are we going to get around this? How are we going to increase this figure?
Well, I mean, I think it's like I said, part of it is having mechanisms that actually have accountability measures, because, I mean, now when we're talking about the United Nations, it's only when there's political will and political support on a specific case or issue that you're going to actually get accountability, otherwise it doesn't exist. But also strengthening mechanisms that already exist and maybe thinking around how we can create new mechanisms. But for example, we have the OECD complaint mechanism in the EU, which allows people to go after companies, but that doesn't have an accountability measure either. And so I think that we have a long way to go, and part of it is by pushing and by understanding the intersectionality, connecting social movements, I think is going to become even more and more important as we move forward. But I think finally also like looking at what we already have and seeing how we can strengthen it, like the Universal Declaration for Human Rights. So for example, you know, the Universal Declaration talks about all of the things that were relevant and are still relevant, but one of the things that is not mentioned in there is digital rights. Right? Like, we don't think about how our presence digitally, we actually have a digital body that exists online, just like our physical body. And that digital body should also have rights the way our physical body does. And many of our governments are today, you know, targeting human rights defenders through digital methodologies. And so we need to start thinking, well, how do we update the things that we have now, like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the mechanisms and so on, to also make sure that they are looking into all of this new technology that we have and how that influences and is being used against human rights defenders as well.
Then you said, Michel, too, that you think it's important we should change the image of the human rights defenders, so they should not be looked upon as enemies. What do you mean by that, and how should that change be done?
Peut-être avant de répondre, je voudrais compléter.
Well, before answering, I'd like to add to what Maryam said, and which was very important, and that's why we shouldn't forget about impunity. And I think it's very important that we remind everyone that it behoves a state to have the responsibility to defend defenders. So what we can see today is that states do not do that. They don't defend defenders. And such a failing in fighting impunity is there because there's no real capacity or will on the part of the states to do so. I mean, you know, the number of countries I've traveled and met with members of the legal judicial system who are, you know, failing, and for many reasons, because, you know, they're corrupt, or in many cases, many countries, you see, you know, the judicial system which is infiltrated by organized crime, and that makes totally inefficient any attempt to try and fight impunity and to carry out the needed, much-needed investigations to highlight those who are responsible and to take them before court and to prosecute them, those who are actually, responsible of human rights violations. So you have to restore the de jure state and also the independence of the different systems and concrete measures that the states must implement to improve the way their judicial system functions. I'm horrified when I travel in several countries and I'm told that the rate of successes of investigation is close to 1%. And, you know, people, you know, feel very happy about this. That means 99% of cases are not investigated. And very often I'm told that it's because the police force doesn't have the means, because it's afraid of reprisals, and there's corruption because the judges themselves, you know, are under threat and they cannot carry out their investigation. So that you really need to fight impunity, and many people are actually fighting impunity, and there are tools that have been implemented to actually help states in this. So now to answer your question, one thing is absolutely clear, and that is, it's the image of these defenders, male and female, that we need to change. We have to change, the negative image that they have in many countries of the world. I mean, in this film, Silas and his colleagues and these female defenders are shown, in a positive image. This is what we have to do. We have to try and counteract, the state that attacks them and that presents them as enemies of the state and political enemies, and many very negative images that's put forth by the states, and I believe that many countries of the European Union, and you were right to mention this earlier on, actually carry a very heavy responsibility for this state of affairs. When you hear certain countries treat defenders as they do, there's reasons to have doubts, because in fact the European Union is supposed to be one of the main actors, players in defending human rights. I mean, these progressive attacks within the European Union frighten me, because I see that this is an obvious threat on human rights defenders in Europe. And to finish, so traveling very much. I mean, some states very cynically tell me, if Hungary does it, if Poland is going to do it, if in France we condemn defenders for having helped migrants, okay, there you have it. Just leave us in peace.
One concrete question on Colombia. You have a peace agreement, and we tend to think that things are fine or getting fine now in Colombia. And then, is there the same need for human rights defenders? Isn't the situation taken care of because you have the peace agreement?
Yes. The situation is really difficult. We can say that figures related with many human rights violations are actually better. The number of killings in general has reduced. The number of kidnappings has reduced. But the violence against human rights defenders, unfortunately, is getting worse and worse and worse. So we passed from having 63 defenders killed in 2015 to having over 100 killed last year. So
why is this, when you have the peace agreement as a parallel development? Why is this happening?
It's because although we believe the peace agreement is really important, and the implementation of the agreement is actually trying to achieve some substantial changes into the country, we still are facing structural human rights problems that have not been solved, and defenders are fighting for those problems. And if we talk about land issues, if we talk about inclusion, if we talk about LGBT people, if we talk about torture, we are still talking about the same problems that we were dealing before the peace agreement, and those have not changed a bit since the peace agreement was signed. Colombia is still the third most unequal country in our continent. And that makes it very difficult for those people living in the faraway areas where the FARC guerrillas were in power to find alternatives for living if there's not a strong transformation from the state, like in general, that includes these people into the system. So defenders have been trying to raise some of those issues, have been kept on defending territories, indigenous territories, Afro-Colombian territories, from new investors, from projects similar to the ones we saw in the movie here, palm oil, infrastructure building, all types of things. And the response to that is new or other or the same old armed groups attacking them, other interests behind. And I would come then back to your question related on impunity. We have a rate of over 95% of impunity cases. We have over 1,000 death threats in the last 5 or 6 years, and we have 1 conviction for a death threat in Colombia. We have a couple of convictions for killings, but those killings only sanction the person that actually shot or killed the defender, but doesn't go into who was behind that, doesn't look for the motives, doesn't look for the interests that were behind the killing. So it's a matter actually of political will, I would say. I agree with you. We have lots of laws, decrees, all type of legal norms. We have a huge judiciary. We have everything you can think of if you wish to actually make justice, and it doesn't happen.
But then we have a positive to look forward before we open now to have your questions too. I just want to have, something that actually is positive, and it sounds like the Protect Defenders, your project, is something that gives hope, Gerald.
Give me hope. That's a good question at the end. No, maybe to say that I think there are some areas where a lot of work has been developed over the years. And OMCT and other organizations have been doing a lot of human rights defenders protection work. I think where we progress is really how we as NGO community, also with the help of certain states, and with the mandates like Michel Forst's mandate, how can we do protection work when there are immediate threats? How can we alert that something is happening? And very often alerting through a public appeal, mobilizing the media, having Michel Forst and others intervene can be life-saving. It can make a difference between the disappearance and torture or not. So there are systems that are in place, and I think the delegate from the European delegation has mentioned Protect Defenders. Protect Defenders is a consortium of 12 organizations with expertise in human rights defenders protection, and OMCT is one of the 4 leading organizations in that, and that means intervening when there's a case. Let's assume, and this we do also with what is called the Observatory for the Protection of Human Rights, a program we have. Let's assume there's a defender in Bangladesh, Adil, a friend of ours. He gets arrested the day we have the fireworks here in Geneva. He gets arrested by somebody, nobody knows who the people were that arrested him. So it's immediately important that there's an alert going out, that people mobilize, that the government there knows somebody's watching. That can be huge security at that moment. But then mobilizing people who can help in that situation. Security grants, emergency grants, IT security, legal support. There is a possibility to provide defenders with that type of protection. In the worst case, with relocation into security into a third country. You have even in Europe a number of countries that have shelter cities, institutions where people like writers in need can go when they're immediately threatened. So there's a lot of work happening, and we're doing a lot of work every year for more than 300 defenders under threat in that sense. But all this is at the last line. It's about the physical protection. And I think if we really want to advance in the protection of human rights defenders, we also have to stand by their causes. We have to support them in the causes they present. In a way, not being just agnostic and say if there's a physical threat, we relocate somebody. No, we want that these people can continue working in their country. It's a drama that Maryam is sitting here in a way and not working in Bahrain at the moment. So we have to think of what are the tools we can employ so that people can continue their work in the country. But yes, Protect Defenders is a huge help to defenders with emergency grants, with relocation, institutional support when that support is not there. It's a lifeline of support that is there, and we're very grateful to have that possibility to help.
But Maryam, are you afraid? What makes you continue working like you do? Aren't you scared?
The easy answer would be no. I think that we broke the barrier of fear in 2011, but I also have to admit that I'm speaking from a place of privilege. I live in Denmark. I don't live in Bahrain. Albeit I do get threats, and I know that I'm targeted, and I know that I'm generally not 100% safe anywhere I go. But I think that what happens is that you find something that's more important than your fear. So even, I mean, right now I would say I'm not afraid, but when I was in Bahrain, I was. And when I was in prison, I was afraid. But I think what I learned from my father and from my mom and from others is that courage is not the absence of fear. It's finding something that's more important to do than giving into your fear. And so that's what courage is, because if the fear doesn't exist, then it's not really courage. It's something normal that anyone can do, right? But if I can just add very quickly as well, Protect Defenders, I think, has done, they've done a massive job at helping people and relocation and so on, because I've actually seen a lot of those cases. I think one thing that's to me is very important that I think sometimes gets lost in the conversation is governments have now learned that if they can keep someone in prison long enough, they tend to be forgotten, or there isn't as much work on their cases anymore. So if the government can put up with all of the initial backlash of, especially with high-profile defenders, putting them in prison, after 5, 6, 7 years, there isn't as much attention on their cases anymore, and they can spend a really long time in prison. And so I think this is like Protect Defenders is a really great initiative, and it's a really great project, and it's really making a lot of difference. And I think one of the things that we need to also start thinking about as well, how do we also address the cases of people who have now been in prison for 15 years, 10 years, 7 years, as well.
One example there is Davik Isaac, of course, in the Eritrean, Swedish Eritrean, who is in prison in Eritrea since many, many years now. We don't even know if he's alive. I now want to give the floor to all of you who have listened for you to ask questions or make comments. I'm trying to see a hand over there. A lady in blue, please go ahead. There's a microphone that will come.
I think we heard a lot about corrupted governments, but we didn't talk a lot about the corruptors. So I wanted to know whether the human rights defender, what they think about the attacks of multinationals, also in justice, the access of justice they have, the trials they have, the costs of justice, which are very far, the defamation campaigns against them, that put friends against them, and all the organizations that are forbidden. What do you think about that?
Who wants to respond? Gerald, I think, yeah?
Maybe Michel wants to come in as well, but I think in the film you've seen that there's a conglomerate of interests that defenders touch, and that is the threat usually. There's a state interest, there's corruption in the state, there are multinational, in various layers, these companies. I mean, it's not just one company that is there, but they operate in so many different layers, and the threat often comes also from that side. The private security people that they employ. And I think one of the things we see when we protect human rights offenders in those type of situations, you often don't actually know who is at the origin of the threat. Because it is so unclear and sometimes deliberately unclear. And there is enormous work to be done in terms of corporate accountability, business and human rights. There's a lot of things happening, but a lot more that has to happen. And it's very easy for an outside multinational company to say, well, we don't control exactly who is on the ground, but they benefit and are part of that system. But there's one other element that I think in a debate in Geneva that always strikes me. When we say multinational companies, we automatically think about our Western companies. How many times have you seen in the film the Chinese flag being on the table there? Because more and more you have that, you have companies that are not Western bound, which you reach even more difficultly in terms of human rights dialogue. And that is a huge changer in the protection of human rights and the protection of human rights offenders in many parts of the world, and certainly in Africa, but also in Asia. And it changes completely how the zones of influence are. What can Europe do? What are others doing? Sadly, the reaction of European governments is often to say, well, our trade interests become so fragile, so we have to find a softer landing route, as they often use the term. But what does it mean to a defender then in Cambodia? It means that the only outside influence is China. So I think there is an enormous work to be done on business accountability, and especially in regards to defamation of human rights offenders on the ground, because that is often the very roots of the problem.
Would you like to add something, Michel?
Just to add to what was said, I mean, there's something we can see coming out in the film, and on several occasions, is the consultation mechanism, and the source of the problem is often the question of the consultation of the people, who are impacted by international projects, whether it be, an international project, a dam, a mine. And in fact, one thing is absolutely clear, and that is that, the state signs an an agreement with a company or with a development bank to develop a region without even consulting those people involved. And then the consultation mechanism is such that, you know, the company sets up, you know, a system where they said they come to see the people. We've decided to develop, and we're going to come and consult you, but we're not going to consult you on the source of the problem. So what is missing, and we can see this very clearly in the film, is that, you know, the communities that are impacted, you know, should actually be given the power to say no. And we want to consult you on your will or your non-will to develop this part of the country. And the community says no, then the consultation should just stop there and then, and you don't consult them on the assistance mechanism of the project. The people don't want. I mean, we can see that the people, you know, don't want those mechanisms that are there to assist them in the project. So let me tell you about an anecdote, and which has to do with, you know, the defenders, you know, versus the world of multinationals. There's a company that were telling me, a European and Italian company that works, you know, in the industry. They said we've developed, you know, very sophisticated consultation mechanisms that's very much, you know, upstream. And they anticipate we go to a country and we consult with the, you know, local people to tell them, you know, we have a project for you, and, you know, do you want this project? We describe it, we tell them about, you know, the pros and cons, and if the community says no, then the company says, you know, we actually pull out. And what happens then? That's what Gerald described. This is a Chinese company that's going to come in, and they're going to do much more harm than the Italian company, which at the beginning, you know, had much better intentions, even if at the beginning the project is not desired by the people. So there's a real problem here. Some states have tried to set up consultation mechanisms that are appropriate ones, and there's a lot of work being done now by the United Nations Working Group on corporations and human rights to try and give guidelines and give keys to the companies to actually establish protocols for consultation mechanisms for the people that are impacted. And we'll see this happening more and more in the coming weeks and coming months.
I saw the lady here with the green scarf in the front, please.
Merci beaucoup pour votre intervention.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. So I had a question. On several occasions, we noted that there was a regression in developed countries, industrialized countries, and things were getting worse in terms of human rights. So how can you explain that's actually we're going backwards? And individuals such, you know, when he or she has the means of having the needed education, and today is actually bringing into question the protection that human rights gives those very same people. How do you explain this?
Who feels like you would like to address
I mean,
this?
I think it depends on context for sure. So it's different from country to country. I know that at least in Denmark, people feel threatened by the influx of refugees, and the politicians play on that. And so the media and the politicians, they use fear tactics because it's the best way to raise votes. And so, for example, in the last election, the Danish People's Party was able to get some of the highest number of votes in the country, even though they didn't used to be able to before, because of the fear-mongering. And what's really dangerous is when you start seeing some of the political parties who are supposed to be leftist join that campaign. And so in Denmark, what was, I think, quite surreal that the Danish People's Party and the Social Democrats, who are supposed to be leftist and who are supposed to be, you know, pro-justice and so on, they were competing on who could create the better ads of anti-refugees and anti-immigration in Denmark. And to me, like, that's when the alarms need to start going off, because we understand that when the right-wing political parties are doing it, because that's a lot of what their politics is based on. But when the leftists start doing it as well, then that's, you know, extremely dangerous. The United States, I think, is a little different. I think in the United States, because the discourse on, you know, on racism, on sexism, on all of these different things is actually becoming stronger. That there's a group of, you know, people who believe in white supremacy and white nationalism who feel like they're at risk now. And so that becomes a lot stronger. And therefore, there's also this want and need to believe in conspiracy theories, believing that the media is the enemy, believing that the government is the enemy, believing that we need someone in power who's going to take care of us, who's going to bring us back to that glory of before, where some people were a lot more privileged than others. So I think, again, it really depends on the context, but that's, I think, why we're seeing so much of this nationalism come up and so much of this populism. Because of so much of it is based on information that a lot of times is not accurate. And so if you look at the actual studies that have been done, countries that take in refugees usually have better economies than they did before they did take in the refugees, right, in the long term, and so on. So there's a lot of misinformation, and it's not by coincidence, it's on purpose that there is that misinformation. And it's to get those votes, is to raise this kind of fear. And I think, and I'll end with this, the thing that scares me the most is that it's a vicious circle. Because what we see is, we have, these politicians who create this type of fear-mongering and use the media to do that as well. They get elected because they create so much fear amongst the population of, these bad, evil people who are going to come and take over the country, that they elect them into power. These people then give weapons and deals to governments like Saudi Arabia, like Bahrain, like others, who usually are at the very core of creating radicalization and extremism. And then that leads to terrorist attacks and violence, which then only refeeds into this fear-mongering and the creation of fear and hate politics that is happening in Europe. And so it becomes a cycle where it just feeds into itself. And until we can break that cycle, whether it's through the stopping of the selling of arms, whether it's through pushing countries to respect human rights, to decrease radicalization, and I think this is one of the biggest threats of shutting down civil society space and where human rights defenders can't work anymore, is that generally in countries where you no longer have human rights defenders because they're all in prison or in exile, that's when you see a rise in radicalization and extremism, and it's a result of oppression. And so until we start understanding that also here in Europe, I think the cycle is going to continue.
Interesting. It's getting late, but let's have a couple of questions. I think I saw some arms over here. Someone who wanted to ask a question. Oh, you changed your mind? Okay, here. Go ahead.
Je vais essayer de parler en français.
So I'm going to try and speak in French. So I'd like to thank you for all the clarifications you've given us. So I would like to tell a story. I am from Rwanda. And in Rwanda, when things happened, people came to tell us that they didn't know what was happening. And today, there are many countries who are acting exactly like Rwanda. What is the reaction of people like us, whether we're left, right, or center? I'd like that each and every one of us should say, I could do this. But, to plead ignorance can no longer function. So what is happening in Syria today? What is happening today, anywhere else? I mean, there are, as many wars and blood being poured, people being killed, and nobody is actually moving a little finger. So how can we ensure that people, feel involved, so that it never happens again?
Any of you feel like you want to comment on that and answer that? He's asking for more.
Je crois peut-être que c'est une question.
This is a question which could actually conclude our debate. There's no possible conclusion except that everyone should actually follow your appeal to commit, and even more so. And with the tools that we have at hand today, and also with the better knowledge we have of what is happening around the world, where nothing can be left unknown, many more of us should commit. So you should commit.
A woman at the very back who wants to ask the last question, and then we're going to wrap up.
Bonsoir. Tashi Delek.
Good evening, Tashi Delek.
From Tibet, refugee born stateless in India. And today is my question goes to Special Rapporteur. Today is a commemoration of 59th Uprising Day, and we had a very big peace march in Nation, but we realized that actually the public is here, UN is sleeping. And my question actually goes to human situation of Tibet. The media, the sensation, the solidarity is disappearing, unfortunately, like many cases about ethnic minorities, indigenous issues, environmental vulnerabilities in this world. But China, we know, is going very strong. But the hope is there. My question is about human rights defenders. Which human rights defenders issues that Special Rapporteur is following up on Tibet? Because we listen right now that most of the time the defenders, people who live under, who are marginalized, the groups who are vulnerable, they are not informed. So which kind of cases you are following up on Tibet? And the second question is, if any of the human rights defenders who are on the stage, if you can give us any feedbacks, ideas, how we as Tibetans can bring Tibet issue to the next stage, because our movement is non-violent, it's about freedom, it's about being visible, and we want to live.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Let's see if Michel wants to say something about the situation and bring up.
Rapidement, donc non pas pour évoquer la situation.
So very quickly, again, Tibet is not within my mandate, and the Tibetan defenders, are within my mandate. Yes, I received a lot of information and complaints from your friends and colleagues from Tibet, and we act exactly the same as we act with all other states, with the same systems of communications, with the same confidential information that is passed on, and the results are not up to expectations. And the dialogue that we have on the Tibetan issue does certainly not match your expectations or hopes. Neither do they match mine.
Just on this one, I think, first of all, solidarity on this very special day for Tibet. And I think it's also where we have to be careful internationally. China is becoming so powerful, and it tries to immunize this issue. When I grew up, Tibet, when you said human rights, probably many people in Germany would have said Tibet as one of the examples. I'm not sure it's still the case. And I think we cannot permit that countries basically immunize whole discussion and insulate discussions on major human rights causes, and I think Tibet is part of this.
And also, as you really express your wish to work and for things to get better actually in Tibet, and that is exactly the role and this passion for human rights defenders that you all have here, and that I think it sounded like you also have, and I wish you best of luck. And I want to thank you, the four of you. It's been very interesting, really indeed, listening to you. You gave different perspectives, concrete examples, and there is hope. There is hope for more engagement. There is hope for less impunity. And I really wish you best of luck. And thank you all of you for coming and listening.